video. It is exactly 12, well, no, it's 12:01 p.m. here on the East Coast in the United States. I'm once again joined by my longtime friend and comrade and collaborator, Sukant Chandan of the Malcolm X movement. Hey, Sukant.
Greetings, Comrade Eric. How you doing? Good to be back here with you.
Yeah. I'm doing okay. You know, there's a lot to talk about. We haven't really had a chance to plan out a whole conversation here, so we're going to kind of wing it. I put together some images for, to help frame our discussion of what it is that, we need to highlight. But of course, we can go in whatever direction we want. Sukant, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I've been buoyed up due to the French uprising. God bless Nahel Merzouk's mother and family. But that's collective action. You take one of ours, the whole country goes up. So good.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, we should have. We should have tried to get together to talk about what was going on in France. I missed it for various reasons. Do you want to talk on that for a minute?
Yeah, thanks. It's globally important actually. There's so much to be said, so it's difficult to pinpoint what the primary issues are. The primary issue, of course, is resistance, and is the united resistance of the most oppressed working class against the colonial state, and in this context, the French colonial state. And it's just fascinating just to see the dynamics at play of the uprising, which in the process of the uprising and in the act of the uprising itself, it's a counter rejection to so many problems that we're facing in the world politically today. It's a rejection of the racist division between working class communities. It's a rejection of the demonization and the racist instrumentalization of migration. The uprising says, actually, we're proud of our migrant communities and we'll stand together with them. It's a rejection of the divisions between North Africans on the one hand and the relative internalization of white supremacy in other so-called sub-Saharan African diaspora communities, that they're all united against the French colonial state. And there's so much more to be said, but I think Counterpunch have been kindly have accepted an article that's going up on Counterpunch Plus in just over a week. So I hope people will get a chance to read that. But I think the important thing really to understand as well from the French uprising, to finish on this, Eric, and thanks for allowing me to comment on this, is that I think what now has clearly emerged in the last 10, 15 years is what really is the actually existing radical anti-colonial socialist culture and struggle within the West that's defined by, in Britain, August of 2011 and June the 13th, 2020, the George Floyd uprising in Minneapolis, the ongoing French resistance, and now the uprising. This is the veritable, actual radical socialist culture, tradition, and politics that was defined from 1914 to 1920 by people like Lenin and Ho Chi Minh, M. N. Roy, James Connolly, and others. So it's all really.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to quickly ask you before we jump into the other international issues. To what extent was this? Well, let me put it this way. Those of us in the United States somehow feel often that we kind of have a monopoly on racial violence perpetrated by the police, because of the nature of the U.S. media, because of the obvious, police killings and brutality that just everyday occurrence in the United States. So what I want to ask you is, are the issues that are bubbling up to the surface in France, and in London, as you mentioned, in Britain years ago in 2011, et cetera, are they the same as what we have in the United States, or is the level of violence different? How is the oppression similar and different? To what extent can U.S. viewers understand the uprising in France within those terms?
Yeah, I think they're very similar, actually. And, between Britain and France and the US, you have nuanced but important differences of political histories that inform the political present. And so the shading of the different political situations are slightly different. Of course they are. US has a colonial Republican history of overthrowing British colonialism and its relationship to the enslavement of African people, Jim Crow segregation, civil wars, etc. These are all important things to understand in the US context, and they lead to a more detailed and accurate understanding of US politics as it pertains to our politics and principles. And that's why I think Lenin understood that really well. Marx and Engels understood US history really well. And they especially in Lenin's advocacy in terms of his leadership in the USA around 1914 to 1920, I think he had a really accurate leadership around the radical politics of the USA, which informs really the ongoing challenges today. Britain has a reformist, feudal monarchist culture historically, which also informs the situation today in our communities, which results in a relative to the French and the US context, grassroots communities here are much more insecure, divided, weaker, second guessing themselves, etc. The French Republican tradition is very arrogant, and not too dissimilar in some ways, perhaps, from the US political histories as well. But in that arrogance, inadvertently, it brings an anti-colonial kind of self-confidence and arrogance to the communities there as well. Well, if you're going to be so arrogantly secular and Republican in your racism, well, we might just be a bit arrogant in our counter-racism and our anti-colonial radical politics. And like if you see like young black and migrant communities in Britain, US, and France. France is different from Britain only as much as this, and it's really important. They're more combative, they're more confident, they're more vibrant, and they kind of walk the streets like they own it a little bit more than they do in Britain. But they have these Algerians there, Eric. These Algerians, which the parallel in the British context is the Jamaican community, a witty, politically insightful, ready to fight back, don't take any shit, type of people. But the Algerian Jamaicans are also different as well. So it's really all a very interesting, complex, concentric kind of pictures and circles here.
We should probably do another conversation where we delve into some of those issues a little more deeply. But for now, since we are limited on time, let's talk some international issues. I did not prep you at all for any of these. I just pulled some images for us to talk about. So forgive me if you feel that I've put you off course or whatever. But let's talk a little bit. Let's start with some talking about China and the role that China is playing globally right now. Just a couple of stories. There's so many to choose from. Here's one that I think is kind of interesting that deserves a little bit of attention. So Reuters published an investigative piece that was quite good, talking about the U.S. firm that is now involved, and this has just been confirmed in this story, that is involved in bringing a high-speed fiber optic cable underneath the Indian Ocean, linking the U.S. naval base at Diego Garcia. So, as we know, and I'm not going to get into all the details, you can find it on Reuters yourself, but as we know, the U.S. has run this naval base in Diego Garcia. It's one of the U.S.'s primary means of projecting power in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean area generally. And now they have officially confirmed, as a result of this report, that the United States now has linked, using this high-speed internet cable, this military base. So the idea, of course, being that there is something like a tech arms race going on in East Asia between the United States and the Chinese. This report lays out the company that is involved in carrying this out. Again, this company is called Subcom. And Subcom is controlled by Cerberus Capital Management, which is one of the major venture, capital. What's the word I'm looking for? It's not really a hedge fund. It's a capital management firm that is controlled and run by a very well-known and well understood Trump lackey. So this is somebody who is very close to Donald Trump, who runs the company that owns this company that is doing this work. So let me just throw it out to you, Sukant. What do you make of the US's sort of designs, imperial designs, or whatever you want to call it, around the Indian Ocean vis-a-vis China, and the fact that the company that is involved in doing this, which is a world renowned undersea cable company, is maybe could be understood as being controlled by Trump proxies?
Just to clarify, the laying cables to connect Diego Garcia base to where?
Good question. I believe it is to land-based servers that the U.S. controls, presumably in India and elsewhere around in that area. I'd have to look back at the article to find the details.
Yeah,
But the
no,
bottom line is it's a
yeah.
fiber optic cable. And of course, I don't have the link in front of me here, but it is a fiber optic cable that is designed to bring them like extra super high speed internet access, which is what you would need for, things like controlling drone fleets and other things of that nature that would require extraordinary bandwidth.
Yeah, before I make a direct comment, I'd just like to big up the Chagosian Islanders who've been struggling against the US and British base in the Indian Ocean and the way that they've been usurped from their land. It's important political struggle in regards to British and US imperialism. But that aside, okay, just to kind of like to make some kind of informed kind of commentary on this. I hadn't heard about this news report, so thank you for sharing that with me. It seems to point to the growing infrastructure of military containment towards China. That's what it basically indicates. And if it's coming from the Trump camp, that fits very neatly into the general Trump community's attitude towards China as being a primary global competitor that needs to be contained and brought to heel. Also, it's interesting in relation to if they're laying cables down to and they have some presence in India as well. India is a really fascinating part of this whole global picture as well. India plays a very quite. I'm no supporter of Modi and the BJP. Quite the opposite. However, they play quite a sophisticated game when it comes to navigating their global relationships with Russia and different states in the West, but also China as well. But in general, India allows itself to be used, and it has its own kind of narrow nationalist posture in contradiction to and vis-a-vis China. So I think going forward, although the Indian political class of any political persuasion and coloration will seek to develop its relations for its own best interests, nevertheless, there is this division since the 60s between the Chinese and the Indian state, in which the Indian state is quite comfortable to fit into Western leading agendas vis-a-vis China. So you have the similar things going on with the AUKUS kind of infrastructure building against China in the Pacific and the South China Sea in particular, in which India doesn't really have much of a problem with and is quite happy to see develop. And also when it comes to Sri Lanka, probably India is quite happy that to see China being pinched there in recent years. And obviously, if there's a partnership that they can have with the USA that's present in Diego Garcia as well, India will probably be happy to open the door increasingly towards that as well. Of course, India is a world leader in new tech as well, so that they might be looking for certain advantages and perks for themselves out of that. So unfortunately, I mean, for me, I mean, it's a weird situation to be in. It's such a complex political situation, but I'm not favorable to India playing into the plans of the Trump camp in general in Asia and vis-a-vis China. Despite yeah, go on.
Yeah, so here's from the article that I was just trying to pull. That SubCom's importance can be split into two categories: one military, one economic. So they're looking to expand the Navy's undersea cable network, and then also on the commercial side, they want U.S. companies developing these cables. And what's interesting, I mean, this is sort of, I don't know, you could say it's sort of obvious, but I don't think most people are paying attention to this aspect of the US-China competition. And here's the other key point here. There are only 4 major companies in the world that manufacture and lay subsea cables: America's SubCom, Japan's NEC, France's Alcatel, and China's HMN Tech. So that is where this sort of tech arms race is happening with these undersea cables. And if you, in the article, the U.S. government refuses to confirm any of the information from Reuters other than that this cable exists, but they don't explain what it's connected to, where those connections go, or anything like that. But we can assume, based on SubCom's prior work, it can be connected to everything from land-based servers to 5G hubs and towers to all sorts of internet-based infrastructure. So this is a vast project that's, I'm sure, tens of billions of dollars just right now, probably hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of the next several years, as the United States seeks to sort of monopolize internet infrastructure, or maybe not monopolize, but try to undercut China's desire to monopolize the Asian internet infrastructure.
Yeah, so you probably know that, especially when it comes to Australia, there's a lot of controversy and a lot of mockery towards Australia in its AUKUS deal around the nuclear submarine. So you've probably heard that there's a deal that has been brokered by the Australian state with the US state with support from the UK or Britain, that there's going to be a nuclear submarine stationed in Australia, but the submarine hasn't been built, basically, and so it's all a plan for the next couple of decades. So it's been treated as it's been a bit of a created a bit of a political fracas there, and it's a little bit kind of comedic. But when you bring in the story that you have, this is a very serious thing and a very real thing that's going on. It's not just the politics of culture and politicking. There is a military infrastructure build up in the Indian Ocean that's targeting China there. I mean, I have a lot of criticisms on China. However, I do not support a military and a militarist build-up and confrontation towards China. I think that has to be opposed while also telling the truth about what China is, and not trying to make out China as some kind of new Red Dawn state, you know, et cetera, et
What's
cetera.
interesting about this too, Sukant, is that for years we heard about the String of Pearls. We heard about the Chinese desire to project their naval power through the Indian Ocean and towards Africa. This was supposed to be part of, you know, this actually, the whole String of Pearls stuff really predates the One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative, all of that stuff, the New Silk Road. It predates all of that. It goes back to the Bush years. And this was the kind of the beginnings of China's desire to begin projecting its power after several decades of its, you know, domestic industrial ramp up. And now we're at a stage where China has already begun projecting that power, and through the Belt and Road on land. And now we see kind of the pendulum swinging the other way, as U.S. imperialism says, oh, wait a second, they actually are doing it. Now it's our time to sort of punch back. And I think that the Trump years provided this very strange sort of blip in the broader imperial sort of trajectory of the United States. And I think part of that had to do with the manner in which Trump and Trump's people confronted China, which was very different from the traditional sort of U.S. imperialist stance towards Beijing. So what do you make of this transformation, if we want to call it that, in recent years, of this more direct confrontation?
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that Obama did pivot to Asia, and that was a strategic shift. But you're correct as well. You know, Trump made explicit. I mean, in a sense, I mean, you're right. Before Trump, it was kind of, the West didn't want to admit publicly that China was a strategic threat. They kept that away from the public, more or less. It got more awkward, as we remember, with the Beijing Olympics, which, if I'm not mistaken, was 2008.
That's right. And it was during the Olympics that Russia-Georgia war began, when Russia fought its little war against Georgia.
You're saying that's not a coincidence?
Not a coincidence.
That is very interesting, yeah, to reflect upon that.
Well, Putin and Putin was there in Beijing, and then had to be called away because they had to go and shell Abkhazia or whatever. So what
was China's official position during the Georgia War?
If I recall, China didn't necessarily take much of an official position, though. I think in the behind the scenes. Again, this is pre Xi Jinping. This is before China had sort of made this transition to a more assertive foreign policy. I think the Chinese, I don't know, knowing the Chinese, they probably called for calm on all sides or some bullshit.
Yeah, I want to just go back to that and just have a little double check. Thanks for sharing all of that. So yeah, so but with the Beijing Olympics, I think what the Beijing Olympics did because it was impressive. They organized a good Olympics. It was an impressive opening and closing ceremony. You know, in the politics of the Olympics, I mean, I'm not really interested in any of that. Olympics has never really attracted me growing up as a thing, and I just find the whole expenditure and the whole show just to be a bit ridiculous. However, on that level, which a lot of people do engage with, and people judge things, you know, on these kind of ridiculous, silly, capitalist, show-offy, kind of glitzy kind of levels, they ran a good show, and they showed themselves to be at least the equals in terms of running the infrastructure and delivering the whole thing. I'm only saying all of that to say that it did create some anxiety in the West. That, oh, China looks quite successful. Oh, China looks quite like functional. They, you know, they can run these big things. That is usually the kind of the monopoly of the West. And so I think definitely in the British state context, the British government, I think, felt around the the Beijing Olympics that they could afford to push that envelope a bit further in terms of, look, China is a bad thing. We don't like what's happening with China. And I think Obama's pivot to Asia quote also kind of just pushed it, you know, enough, not too loud and dramatically, but explicitly and modestly enough to get the point across. China is a problem going forward, and people don't think that it isn't. So ever since then, we've seen just a constant ratcheting up of tension. And then you're right, Trump normalizes the anti-China kind of rhetoric. And of course, the pandemic and COVID and Wuhan and all of these things is all thrown into that whole toxic cauldron of racism, etc., against the Chinese. Yeah, absolutely, it's an interesting thing. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Every bourgeois kind of government, whatever it does, the next administration, even if it's the opposition, it takes on the previous administration's things and runs with it. And there's like there's a continuity and a deepening around that. And we've seen that with Biden, the transfer from Kamala Harris from Trump as well. There's so many continuities. It's like, hold on a second here, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think that all is very interesting. China are in a more awkward position when it comes to their quote string of pearls as well, not least because Sri Lanka played such an important part in that whole kind of what they wanted to construct across the Indian Ocean. But Sri Lanka is an awkward ally now with China because of all the crises and the uprisings
and what you're pointing to, just for listeners and viewers who maybe don't know, what you're pointing to, of course, is China's role in basically helping to tank the Sri Lankan economy, or maybe you could say it slightly differently, and refusing to bail out the Sri Lankan economy that it had sort of presented itself as this kind of financier.
Well, first of all, they deeply and historically and profoundly effed up by backing the Rajapaksa state against the Tamils. So it really starts with that. I mean, you're going to alienate the half of the population of Sri Lanka by that. Okay, well done. So they're gone. They don't like you anymore. And then you back the state when even the Sinhala working class are rising up with a Tamil working class against the whole economic crisis and the political crisis of Sri Lanka. China is seen as backing the enemies of the people.
And it was all strategic decision making, right? I mean, it was about Hambantota Port and, you know, a couple of other financial considerations, and that was about it for the Chinese.
Well,
really,
I think that so this is the interesting thing. The West, with the element of liberalism that's embedded in their institutions and their global institutions, they'll talk hypocritical and double standard and deceitful rhetoric about human rights, about the rule of law, about, you know, China has no reason to do that, and it doesn't do that. So Sri Lanka. So in the context of Sri Lanka, China doesn't even pretend to play to the Sri Lankan public. It just hardbacks the Rajapaksa state, and that's all that it is. I don't know, you know, but it's just reflective of how poor the Chinese are when it comes to the Hearts and Minds campaign.
Well, speaking of China's somewhat bankruptcy when it comes to Hearts and Minds, there was another interesting story that I want to shift to give a little bit of focus to. So we're going to go through a tweet thread, but before we get to that tweet thread, here's the story that I want to talk a little bit about. Netanyahu visiting Beijing. Now, this is very interesting. There was a time not so long ago when something like this would have been unheard of, right? That the Israelis would be out there making these kind of diplomatic meetings with an obvious sort of oppositional force against the United States, right? So Netanyahu is planning and has already announced a meeting with Xi Jinping. Now, he is being blasted in Israel for this decision. Now, before we get into the response, I want to just get your initial reaction to this, because you just mentioned China finding itself in this somewhat awkward diplomatic situations, and I would regard this as an extremely awkward situation, maybe less so for China than it is for Netanyahu and for the Israelis.
So this is interesting. So what? So Netanyahu is getting attacked in Israel for a planned meeting with Xi Jinping.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe let's just get into that then. So here's the tweet. This
Yeah.
comes, this was actually a thread. It comes from Amos Yadlin, who is a well-known Israeli general, who is kind of understood, as I understand it, he's sort of understood to be very much in the Israel pro-US, have to always be close to Washington camp, right? And so here is his thread. Right. So this was 5 tweets. The briefing on Prime Minister's intention to visit China next month is a signal to the Biden administration that Israel has strategic alternatives, is an Israeli attempt to imitate the Saudi diversification of support policy. This is a move that will harm the Israeli interest, not promote it. He continues. If someone in the prime minister's circle thinks it's wise to act like bin Salman and show Biden that Israel has another strategic option, they are making a bitter mistake. And we do not understand the importance of the competition between powers in the geopolitics of the 21st century. Saudi Arabia does not receive annual military aid of billions from the U.S., does not depend on the U.S. veto at the Security Council, does not receive the help of U.S. financial guarantees, and does not receive the best weapons. Israel needs a government in Yemen to achieve its strategic goals, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and adding Saudi Arabia to the circle of normalization. He closes here. China regularly, blah, blah, blah. He gives all the reasons why Israel and China should not be strategic allies, and the Israeli signaling is a bluff that is not expected to improve Israel's position vis-a-vis Washington. The prime minister has much stronger cards to play. All right, so this is a segment of the Israeli ruling class rebuking Netanyahu for this decision. I'm not posting these tweets from Yadlin because I would agree with his Zionist views or anything like that, but it does point to an obvious divide in the Israeli ruling class about what the orientation should be. This calls into question Netanyahu's foreign policy vis-a-vis China, but it also calls into question Netanyahu's closeness with Putin, Netanyahu's desire to kind of play this bizarre sort of middle ground of trying to play the West against the East and all of this. So what do you make of all this, Sukant?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. 2 or 3 things comes to mind. First of all, this is really, so for the kind of the least important to the most important, perhaps, this is a reflection of the internal political spats amongst the Israeli political class, Netanyahu's administration, and speaking of that, just big up the resistance in Jenin and all victories to them. So Netanyahu's pushing the card hard in terms of colonization of the West Bank. That's creating certain political consternations and divisions. So it's a reflection of that. And the reason I'm saying that is because there was never a controversy about Tel Aviv's relationship with Beijing. I mean, this is very new kind of politicking, complaining about the Israeli leaders' relationship with the Chinese leadership. The West were in general quite happy with that as well. And so it's why suddenly is Netanyahu now being attacked over these things? And so I think where the bigger, more important politics comes into play here, it's very interesting, this referencing of Riyadh in this regards, which actually inadvertently kind of plays to the fact that both Israel and KSA played not a too dissimilar role in the region, actually. So it kind of gives that away. But also, I don't think anything particularly seismic is going. I don't think this reflects some kind of seismic shift of Netanyahu away from the West. Netanyahu knows how to play the game. Netanyahu knows he's an absolutely central, primary partner for all his relationships with Beijing, with Moscow, with London, Paris, and Washington. He knows none of them can afford to drop him as a partner. So he can kind of play, he can posture in this kind of game, in this kind of Zionist state, non-aligned kind of strategy, if he wishes. That all being said, I think also it does reflect a relative inching towards a greater contradiction between the Israeli state as it pertains to its historical senior patrons in Washington. I think there is
you see, Sukant, multipolarity, my friend. There it is.
I was about to start my contribution with just that type of sarcastic kind of piss take, really. Yeah, and also it indicates a new Middle East where by basically US imperialism is out, China is calling all the shots, the people of the Middle East are liberated, basically. So
good.
Well done, Iran, Netanyahu, China, and Putin for liberating. Yeah, I mean, and that's all that's a ridiculization, to make it all so ridiculous. And
the red brown view of the world.
Well, their posture is not too dissimilar to this attack on Netanyahu. Is Netanyahu really going to jump in bed with the Chinese and throw away the USA? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, that's just a nonsense, totally. But again, it shows some relative shifts, and I think we have to be a little bit measured around that. But I don't know. What do you reckon?
Well, no, I agree with you. I think it also reflects Netanyahu's weakness. Netanyahu is very weak at this time. He was much stronger years ago. He has had multiple scandals. There are vast sections of the Israeli ruling class that do not agree with Netanyahu's hard right turn. I mean, Netanyahu was always on the right. This was never a secret, but he's moved further right in as he's kind of, I want to say, incorporated himself into, or maybe a better way of saying it is collaborated with the global far right project that the Russians are involved in, that others are involved in, while simultaneously trying to continue cultivating those ties or preserving those ties with the United States. It's a very awkward line that he's walking. And I think that that's part of what, I think that's part of the pushback from the Israeli elites is like, hey, look, you're potentially jeopardizing something very, very important that predates you and will outlive you. And you're doing it for your own political aggrandizement, for your own political project, and, to enrich yourself, to play to the settler base of his voters and all of these other things, right? So I think that Netanyahu is trying to play all sides, partially because he feels he has to.
Yeah, that's fine.
So in any event, I think that's important to keep an eye on. And, speaking of China and China's somewhat awkward positioning diplomatically, here's another story that kind of illustrates a little more of that awkwardness. So lots of handshake smiles and an aircraft carrier frame Vietnam Prime Minister's visit to China. The point being here, Vietnam continuing to try to play both, right? To maintain friendly relations with the Chinese while also hosting a U.S. aircraft carrier at the very same time, right? So there's this obvious juxtaposition between U.S. military docked in a Vietnamese port and the Vietnamese government having this conversation with the Chinese. I want to get your take on that, given all of the controversies around the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, all of these other things that really do complicate the China-Southeast Asia relations.
Oh, we could talk for hours on this. What can I say? I mean, it's nothing new. Vietnam has hosted US and naval exercises for decades now. It's not unusual for a US aircraft carrier to be on Vietnamese soil. They seem to be there nearly all the time. And also it's unsurprising that the Vietnamese will, like other people in their region, will seek to balance relations with China with the West and the US because they don't trust China for ancient reasons and more modern reasons, which are the same as the ancient reasons, because Vietnam is like, it's like a little colony of China historically. They're just like they're the little black guys down south. There's a I can't remember the name of the book, but you have to study the history of white supremacy in China. There's a black academic in the US who's written a brilliant thing, a book on this. It's really, really well worth everyone studying that. But you can really understand that the peripheral people of the Chinese state and the people just outside of the border of that state, they've always been treated in a kind of a colonial and dehumanized way. Does it mean that I agree with all the decisions of the Vietnamese, all the micro decisions? No, it doesn't. I'd rather see a slightly different situation in Vietnam. But that being said, I know my old, now former comrade was very disparaging of the Vietnamese and was very pro-Beijing. But that's just a little bit of a colonial, arrogant posture that's not really recognizing the legitimate concerns, to use that phrase, in relation to the Vietnamese as it pertains to the much bigger brother neighbor to the north. Let's not forget, China invaded Vietnam in 1979, in which the Chinese got defeated by the Vietnamese forces, who just 4 years earlier defeated the third colonial occupation since 1945.
Not to mention multiple overthrows of Vietnamese kingdoms going back to time immemorial.
That's what I'm saying. The ancient
Yes.
history is here. So people. I mean, this kind of pro-Beijing red-brown community, then that just in so doing erases all of this actual histories and realities, is something I would really encourage people to guard against, and to do your own objective, research and history. It's really interesting.
Well, I want to give you a chance to finish up any comments you want to say about China, because I want to shift over to another imperialist monster, and that is the imperialist monster where you reside. So let's talk a little bit about British imperialism here. But go ahead.
China, I think China should be a lot more generous towards the Vietnamese. They can afford to, in the metaphorical sense and the actual sense, and if they really want to have strategic, this is the thing. This is the thing I don't.
But don't Chinese capitalists compete with Vietnamese capitalists these days? I mean, Vietnam is displacing China in a lot of manufacturing, a lot of areas where China had traditionally employed, low wage labor that is now
fundamentally the problem, isn't it? They're both capitalist projects,
right? Yeah, well, of course.
And so if you have a big state like China, which is a capitalist state, then of course all the problems really emanate out of that. And that's the problem there. But I'm saying, if you had a different political system and a political leadership, it should afford a lot more generosity to resolve these things in a just way, to use a phrase that Chinese love to use, in a win-win way.
Oh yeah,
in a lose way.
Speaking of win-win for of the worst kind, the British state has long been in a kind of arrangement with various other states in Africa around issues of refugees and migrants. And there's one particular controversy that I want to highlight right now, and that is the UK's convenient silence on Rwanda. So the UK is engaged in trying to make a deal with the Rwandan government over the refugees and basically pushing migrants out of Britain and shipping them off to Africa, presumably to die. And this question about the British relationship with Kagame and the Rwandan state is very interesting, given the fact that the British right-wing government wants to make a deal with Kagame at the very same time that Rwanda has been highlighted over and over again as a serial violator of human rights, and also, of course, for its long-time support for the M23 rebel group, the M23 rebel group, which is carrying out atrocities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, around the province of Kivu, which is also resource rich and mineral rich and so forth. So talk to me a little bit about, first of all, the British side of this. Suella Braverman recently had, I think, a meeting with Kagame directly talking about this issue, and then more generally about this issue of Rwanda and the role that it plays.
Well, clearly the answer to all of these problems is Prigozhin and Wagner.
Well, of course, naturally, that's the answer to all of Africa's problems, yes.
Well, it's a shame that Prigozhin seems to have kind of been slightly peripheralized at the moment. But anyway, let's see what
Well,
happens
he
next.
got his hand caught in the cookie jar, didn't he?
Yeah, it remains to be seen where he ends up rearing his beautiful head once again.
Yes.
But anyway, that's a connected, interesting thing.
Oh, we're going to get to that in a few minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, cool. So Rwanda plays a very important role for neo-colonialism in Africa. Very, very important role. Not least its role in regards to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Britain is absolutely invested in being, along with the French and the U.S. state and others, and the Belgian state. It's a big. It deploys itself as a big whitewasher and a cover agent to Rwanda's modus operandi, particularly in DRC. Kagame and his state are quite sophisticated. They've clearly had a lot of good PR advice from leading PR companies in the globe. They have a good marketing kind of project. They market themselves very, very well. You'll find people on social media who say Kagame is one of the greatest African or even Pan-Africanist leaders, on the continent. It has a slick media operation, the government, etc., but it's really a very dirty, sectarian, death squad state that proliferates that violence deeply into eastern Congo, particularly the Kivu region, as you suggest. And DRC, of course, is absolutely fundamental to the running of new technologies and the global economy through the mining of its mineral wealth. It's quite funny and a bit embarrassing to see the way the Rwandan government allows itself to be now engaged in this whole disgusting relationship around migration with the British government. Just, I think yesterday, the day before, there was some event in Parliament in which a Rwandan official said, "Look, we can't take more than 500, people from Britain on this kind of people trafficking racket, which is called this migration kind of policy, the Rwanda policy." And the Tory minister was like, just shut up. You can take more. So it's such a nasty, corrupt racket in which Britain is paying hundreds of millions of pounds to Rwanda for trafficking human beings, that it's still being argued in the courts, whether it's, at the moment, the courts have ruled that it's illegal, the Rwanda policy, and now the Tory state is appealing that decision. So it's all of this machinations in bourgeois law that's going on, but it doesn't, it's obviously just a whole disgusting racket. I think this whole Rwanda policy may not ever see the light of day, and it's just part of the Tory culture war to keep their racists ticking over and triggered, so the political support keeps coming for the Tories. I mean, it's just a disgusting racket. I don't know much more that needs to be said.
Well, one thing that I think is important to note here is that this is there's a continuity between what's happening now vis-a-vis Rwanda and the DRC, with basically everything going back to the 1990s. You could really describe this all as one long conflict, and in a sense, it's really I don't know if you want to use the word genocide necessarily, but it's basically a form of a genocide that's been going on since the mid-1990s, that has taken various forms, from a civil war to death squad operations and everything in between. And so I think that part of the issue here is understanding that what's going on in Kivu and with Rwanda and the M23 is really just the latest stage of a multi-decade war, regional war, that has really been, I guess, in a sense, it's a localized war around local issues, but really it's an international war that has been fueled by the United States, by the British, by the French, by the Belgians, also the Chinese and the Russians and others, who have all in various ways tried to exploit what we call, what's called the Great Lakes region, right? All of these countries in the Great Lakes region are vastly wealthy in terms of mineral wealth, in terms of energy wealth, in terms of all kinds of different things. So I guess the overarching point that I want to make here is that understanding the conflict with the M23 rebels on the one side, backed by Kagame, and on the other side, the death squads that are backed by the DRC's government, which also employs their own death squads, who also carry out mass rapes, mass killings, atrocities of all kinds, right? So the various sides here representing international forces and also local forces are all basically implicated in this multi-decade bloodletting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. You know, DRC has always been central to my political advocacy and work since the 90s. It's so centrally important. It's just, you know, and the way that sometimes some radical politics, again, just doesn't really treat it as a serious and primary issue. Of course, the fact that Chinese capital is deeply invested as well tends to, those who are very pro-Beijing, it tends to kind of pull them away from commenting on all of this as well. You remember back in the late 90s, the SADC armies, including the Zimbabwean army, was there trying to defend the Congolese government actually against this kind of neo-colonial violent infiltration coming mostly from Rwanda. And then that whole issue got embroiled in the land sieges issue. Remember, there's Zimbabwean generals are taking Congolese diamonds as bad.
Well, that's what I was just about to say. That's just what I was about to say, because there are Zimbabwean comrades that I've even spoken with who were like, the Zimbabwean government was there to protect its diamond interests more than it was there for anything else. So there's even a question about the motivation, even for a reputedly anti-colonial force like Mugabe it was in Zimbabwe at the time. Yeah. Even they're guarding the mineral wealth that they were stealing out of the DRC. Yeah. So,
that's the point I wanted to develop. Because the point I wanted to kind of get to was that, and now having observed Congo, like yourself, DRC, for a good part of 3 decades, I mean, it's so frustrating and so sad to know that those people don't have a political movement that serves their best interests, right? And then that speaks to the existing politics of the region and the balance of forces in the region, which is a sad. It's just like just so much sadness and trauma upon sadness and trauma. It's just frustrating, you know. And then you see the bloody portraits of Putin going up in protests in Kivu, thinking that Wagner and Prigozhin and Putin are going to be their saviors, which.
And even those, I mean, come on, Sukant, that shit is staged. We know that. This is not some real grassroots outpouring calling for Wagner. They staged this shit just like they did in CAR, just like they did in Mali. I mean, to carry around Putin portraits and Russian flags, give me a fucking break.
Yeah, I know, but it's still, you're right. But it's still, but the way you can just pay people to do this, I suppose. But
that's right, exactly.
But it does speak to a political desperation as well. And not everyone holding a Putin thing is some of them holding the Putin and the Putin portrait and the Russian flag are also, they're looking for an answer. They're looking for a way out. They're looking for a global leadership, and then Putin, very much unlike the Chinese, postures like he's African savior. And so does Erdogan. He postures like he's.
Oh, we're going to get there in a second too.
He postures as African savior, and it's just sad to see that obviously they're part of the problem and not the solution. Go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only other point I want to make here for our politics is understanding also that, like, the history of DRC, the history of Congo didn't end with the CIA assassinating Lumumba. You know what I mean? It's not like our politics ends in 1970. There is a whole history since then that people need to learn and to understand in order to really make sense of what's going on there now. Issues of refugees and migrants going to the UK, that's just the most recent byproduct of a much larger conflict that unfortunately, most people, even on the left, even people who consider themselves, students of international issues, they don't know anything about it.
I was politically active when Laurent Kabila, the father, the former comrade of Che Guevara in Congo, and that's a whole debacle. That I was in '97. He overthrew Mobutu, and he formed a government. Laurent Kabila Senior. And then the role of Mobutu in Africa, very interesting. The way that Western imperialism promoted him as the Afrocentric, authentic black leader of Africa. And then you have this interesting thing with culture and sports, Muhammad Ali's Rumble in the Jungle, which Mobutu, elaborately hosts in his posture. It's all really interesting things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the interest of time, we have to move on a little bit. Let's talk about another African country that figures centrally in a lot of these designs. Mali, of course, we've been talking about Mali a lot here because, of course, Mali is one of the main epicenters of Wagner's operations in Africa. One of the countries where Wagner's mercenaries have been critical in terms of providing support for the military junta that's in charge there. So Mali, what is Mali's future, and what is the future of the military junta now that Prigozhin is out and or seemingly out, and the Wagner's mercenary forces are, well, at least to some degree, questionable? What is their continued commitment in a place like Mali? So there was an interesting, very short article. This was from, I don't know, somebody over at the Council on Foreign Relations, but it gives you some insights into what the U.S. ruling class is thinking about Wagner, about the posture of the Russians in the region. So I just took a couple of pieces of this article, but the bottom line here is that this debacle with Prigozhin and Wagner has now led to a situation for the military junta where they have to at least posture as if they are moving towards some kind of democratic elections and democratic reforms, right? But this then raises a lot of interesting questions, including, will Mali be able to continue demanding the UN mission withdraw out of Mali, which has been their central demand after they ejected the French, right? So the French, quote unquote, peacekeepers, not really peacekeepers, but the Operation Barkhane military forces of the French were ejected by this military junta. Now they're calling for the UN forces to be withdrawn as well. Well, this is anti-imperialism at work, isn't it, Sukant?
Well,
this is anti-imperialism, right?
Well, yeah, to echo our comments about DRC as well. Again, I mean, just people of Mali deserve much better than any of this mess. The dust has not settled yet around PMC, Wagner, Prigozhin issue. It hasn't totally set. We don't know where Prigozhin is going to be placed in his relationship vis-a-vis Putin and the Moscow leadership. That, I think that's an open question at the moment. I can see it going either of two quite dramatically counter opposite ways for him.
Well, before we get to the try to figuring out what's going on with
Prigozhin, I'm not going to comment more on that.
Yeah, the official posture from the Kremlin has been, and Sergei Lavrov made this point repeatedly, that Russia stays. Anywhere where Wagner where Wagner's been, Wagner stays.
Of course,
right? He's going to say that, right? So now here, this is obviously part of the question, right? So what does it mean for, quote unquote, Wagner to stay, right? Because this raises a lot of questions. Number one, Wagner's forces, which are not Russian military directly, even though they use a lot of Russian military hardware in the form of cargo planes and transport equipment and so forth, right? It is not Russian military. These are guys that are operating under a different banner, under Prigozhin's company and so forth. They're the ones who developed all the personal relationships. They're the ones who developed all the on-the-ground ties. They're the ones who know the key advisors to talk to, who to talk to get what, how to maneuver, right? If you just import a bunch of Russian military guys to kind of replace them, you lose a lot of that. And that's the comment that some of these U.S. strategic planners have already made, that you can't just replace Wagner with Russian military and expect the whole operation to continue operating smoothly. So Mali is an interesting case. Central African Republic is an interesting case as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the Russians are officially saying in regards to this directly, we'll send more people, we'll send more weapons. And like you're saying, it's easy to just make some kind of just whatever off the cuff comments. And of course, Lavrov's going to say what he's going to say. I think the Mali junta is in a real big problem here. Massive, massive big fix.
Oh, I give them 12 months maximum.
So we only said within the last 2 months, maybe in the last 4 to 6 weeks, we said the time will come where Wagner will collapse. Something will happen. Wagner will basically not be a force,
and the African countries will be holding the bag.
Yeah, and we didn't. See, we didn't see. I don't know what was in your mind when we were doing these kind of analytical predictions, but what was in my mind was not what actually happened with the march on. I was about to call it the march on Rome, so you can forgive the kind of historical parallel there.
The march on the third Rome.
The march on Moscow by Prigozhin. I didn't think that was going to happen like that. I didn't think it was all going to combust so quickly.
Yeah, well, it was Hannibal and Rome. It was the Ottomans on Constantinople, and now it's Prigozhin on Moscow, right? It's just a historic, epoch.
You should consider writing some sketches on this stuff, Eric. I don't know if you've ever done that kind of stuff, but I'm sure there's lots of great jokes in Russia about.
Are you suggesting that a Jewish comedy writer could be successful? No, come on.
Mate. I could do just a lot of just cackling laughter through all of this, but yeah. So I think the junta isn't a fix. You're saying that you give them a very short period where they're going back in cup in hand. Oh, it's so embarrassing. It's so cringe, Eric.
Oh yeah, they're not going cup in hand to anybody. They're getting dragged out in body bags and chains. There's no doubt about that. And then the French forces will come marching right back in.
The junta, you mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You can see a lot of the considerable section of the Malian population is referenced in part there with the opposition calling for a boycott of the referendum as well. The junta has always postulated, oh yeah, we want civilian rule really, really soon. Don't worry, we're going to sort it out. But obviously,
yeah, just like in Sudan. Yeah, exactly.
Well, exactly. Yeah, good parallel there. Yeah. So I think yeah. You're predicting the junta won't last long. I think that very well may be the case. People are clipping at their heels a whole bunch of other factions, so it doesn't look like it's going to go very far. I'm just really interested to know what's going to happen next with the Russian deployment through Wagner in Africa and what consequences. It probably looks like some juntas might fall and they might go back also to reestablishing relationships with the UN and the French. If I was the Mali junta, I would not want the UN to go right now. That's for sure.
Well, speaking of which, let's take a look at some of this. So here's for the New York Times. I mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations one previously, but this is from the Times. Can Russia tame Wagner in Africa without destroying it? So this is really what I was getting at a minute ago. And if you look at some of this, this is so interesting. Wagner makes liberal use of shell companies to conceal its activities, but through at least half a dozen known entities just in the Central African Republic. It runs a radio station and a brewery. It will soon be bottling water. It is involved in almost every economic activity that you could imagine. Okay. And look at, I love this quote. Russia gave us Wagner. The rest isn't our business, said a special advisor to Mr. Touadera in the Central African Republic. If it's not Wagner, they'll send Beethoven or Mozart. It doesn't matter. We'll take them.
Oh, it's pathetic. It's pathetic to the point of just cringe.
But this shows you the level of dependence. It shows you how deep Russia's forces are entrenched in places like CAR.
Sorry, I'm just trying to not resonate on thinking of such toxic pieces of shit like Wagner rolling into CAR and making money out of the people there. It's just such a
bottling water. Can you imagine? Of all bottled water. It's not, it's bad enough that they're stealing, minerals and stuff, but even the water, come on.
Stealing African water, making a profit out of it. Well,
yeah. So now here's more from that Times article. Yep. In Mali, where about 1,500 mercenaries fight along the national army, Wagner operatives have made liberal use of military transport planes to deliver heavy weapons and to rotate their troops. So here is where you see that kind of direct collaboration between Wagner on the one hand and Russian military. Look at this. In Syria, where Russia's military intervened, the Wagner mercenaries operate alongside Russian soldiers. So as Wagner's columns marched towards Moscow on Saturday, a couple weeks ago, Russian troops surrounded two bases in Syria with Wagner troops inside. I bet that story didn't get enough coverage here in the West.
My God. Yeah, I also noticed that the Russians upped up their bombing nearly at the same time.
Yes, they have.
Prigozhin was doing this with his antics. I think that is in part is to show, look, we're not going away. We're still to try and attempt to say that look, we're not going away. We're still because the Syria thing outside of Ukraine is the biggest Russian military deployment and with which they've made the most kind of attempted to make the most political capital out of since their intervention for what, 7-8 years now. So yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. I think Russia's global reach is contracting and is in crisis now, very much so, in a much more deeper level after Prigozhin's attempted march to Moscow. And I think internally, it's also both things are happening at the same time. There's internal kind of just disintegration. And Lavrov and Medvedev and the entire Russian leadership seem to be saying less as the crises are increasing. Medvedev came out and denounced Lenin again. You know, can't forget denouncing Lenin as being responsible for all of this mess, apparently. So it just seems to be, and you know, again, you would expect Lavrov, who is not an unintelligent man, to give some kind of explanation to the world as to quote Trump, what on earth is going on? You know, there's no explanation. It's so like, and I think the lack of explanation speaks to the lack of the political confidence and leadership in Moscow, which in itself then feeds the same problem in which Putin is being seen as lacking confidence in himself, lacking leadership and courage, and kind of and then you have Zelensky on the other hand, you know, and his forces, they just like, they show the counter opposite of that, confidence in their position, taking advantage of every crisis, rallying their people forward, etc., taking the moral high ground totally one after the other. And I say that not being particularly inspired by Zelensky's political leadership and all of that. Nevertheless, I mean,
well, you mentioned it with regard to Kagame in terms of their slick PR operation. Zelensky has that tenfold. You know, I mean, this is, I would say Zelensky's government, I would say, just real quick, I want to say Zelensky's government is probably, I would say it's reminiscent of Obama in terms of their ability to project a particular image of a, you know, sort of liberal icon and really being able to paper over a lot of neoliberal, awful neoliberal policies. And it's very Obama reminiscent to me.
It is, but Putin is the person who, more than anyone, who's handed Zelensky he's handed all of that to Zelensky on a plate.
Yes.
I am your invader. I am coming to kill your people and your children. You are going to defend all of that.
And you directly, we're going to send assassination squads to get you, right? So that when they don't get you, you're a hero.
All Zelensky has to do is show that he's with the people. He'll walk out on his streets with his semi-casual military olive green clothes and just say, we're defending our land. Remember who the invader is. I mean, it doesn't require a lot of kind of resource, does it? I mean, just the basic contours of the story, just play to Zelensky, you know, and he can just come across as a not unlikable person, which he doesn't come across as an unlikable person, which is really frustrating for Putin, because Putin is really trying to, and the whole Putin camp is trying to say, look, no, he's a bad. I mean, I don't agree with the capitalist leadership and everything that Zelensky's administration is involved in. But it's frustrating for Putin and that camp because they're trying to say, look, he's a bad person. Look how awful he is. And it just doesn't wash. None of it sticks, you know, on the realms of, you know, this kind of what we're talking about, moral high grounds and people who have more, who come across as having more kind of political and moral substance compared to those who are just bankrupt, utterly bankrupt. We're going back to Africa. It's just frustrating we don't have a force that can take advantage of all of this and cut through and really, you know, kind of give African people what they need and deserve. But yeah, I think Erdogan is just constantly rubbing his hands as well.
We're going to get to Erdogan in a second, but just to finish up this point about Russia, Wagner, and Africa, and really what I'm really getting at is what are the implications of this Wagner collapse in Africa vis-a-vis US imperialism and British imperialism and French imperialism, because this is really the central question. It's not just that that we don't like Wagner's, you know, Nazi killers that are rampaging throughout Africa. It's that they also now provide the material basis for the the traditional colonial powers to reassert themselves in Africa, all throughout Africa. So here's the one. Well, if you want to comment on that, go ahead. But I have another story that I want to highlight that illustrates that point really best. And this comes just from a few days ago: Libya, Washington, and Khartoum. The point here, and I didn't get the whole article here. I would recommend people go and find it. But the point here is the United States is reinserting or reasserting itself in Libya. Let's not forget that the United States, after the bombing of Libya and the destruction of the country, basically took a back seat in various ways for various reasons, including in the post-Obama years. Of course, the United States hasn't even had a diplomatic presence inside of Libya since 2014. Most of what the U.S. has done in terms of trying to, quote unquote, manage the peace process has been done from Tunisia, not even in Libya, which has set the U.S. back from its competitors like the Russians and others who have direct presence in Libya. So now that Wagner's forces are collapsing, Russia's position is more tenuous, and certainly more tenuous in the minds of those who were depending on the Russians. Now we have the U.S. reinserting itself into Libya for the first time in a number of years. The CIA director visited Libya. William Burns was in Libya, along with, one can imagine, various other State Department apparatchiks and others. And the whole point here being they are looking to take advantage of Russia's collapse in Libya and in North Africa broadly. And this is the way that they're going to do it, by trying to, again, manage the peace process using elements inside of Libya. They're trying to get closer to the Libyan, quote unquote, government. They're also trying to pry Haftar away from the Russians. And we already know Haftar, going back to the 1980s, was the CIA man. So if we can assume that he's always had a line to the CIA, we can pretty much fairly assume he's still got that line to the CIA. So how many alliances are now going to start shifting, and what impact might that have in a place like Libya, which is still picking up the pieces of 2011?
Yeah. Can Haftar, though, disengage from the alliance, of which he's the junior section of, in an alliance with these states? He's an alliance with UAE, Egypt, and Russia. Can the US and will the US offer to Haftar a better deal than what he's got? Because he's achieved a lot for himself in this alliance, including airstrikes by the Egyptians and the UAE and the Russians as well. I mean, how I say, airstrikes. He didn't manage to take Tripoli, though, did he? A couple of times, which has created. Anyway, that's another whole complicated situation.
That would be Turkey. Turkey's intervention prevented Haftar's march on Tripoli in 2019 and 2020. That was a big deal. We're going to get to that in a minute.
But with the resources of the Egyptian, UAE, and the Russian state, you would have thought then, if they were willing to supply Haftar with what he needed and wanted, he could have done a better job. But it perhaps indicates that even the Russian, UAE, and Egyptian alliance is not willing to roll over Erdogan's sphere of influence in Libya for their own, especially when it comes to primarily Russia, but also Egypt's kind of the way that they need to position themselves with Erdogan. So it's quite complicated. I'm not sure, having said, in line with what I've just said, I'm not sure the US can get Haftar to switch, although it's a possibility, and Haftar I'm 100% sure, definitely discussing with his colleagues whether that is a viable option.
Well,
go on.
Sukant, to your point, you are now segueing me very beautifully into this one, because this is relevant. Turkey and Egypt upgrade diplomatic ties. Okay, Now, just as a backstory for people who maybe don't have all of the background knowledge on this, Turkey and Egypt have had very frosty relations ever since Tahrir Square, the ejection of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood government by Sisi, right? So Sisi's dictatorship has been in power since they ousted Morsi. Well, in that time, they have been at loggerheads with Erdogan and Turkey, which lost a tremendous amount of influence in Egypt when that happened. Turkey and Egypt were on different sides of the civil war in Libya, as we just noted. Turkey stepped in and backed the Libyan, technically the Libyan government in Tripoli, although it's questionable whether they should really be called a government. But the internationally recognized government in Tripoli was backed by Turkey, Turkish drones, Turkish military advisors, Turkish heavy weapons, etc. On the other side was Haftar, who was backed by the Russians, the Egyptians, the UAE, as you noted. Turkey and Qatar, by the way, were backing the Tripoli government together, right? So now we have, several years later, all of this seems to have now shifted again as Wagner and Russia has collapsed. UAE and the Saudis begin to scramble to see what they might be able to hold on to. And now you have Erdogan swooping in and maybe trying to pry Egypt away from the Saudis and
and don't forget they have to control these pesky people called the Palestinians as well. You know, they're a real headache, you know, for all of these players. Palestinians keep operating in their own absolute independent self-interest, and good on them, because their self-interest plays into the collective interest of the world revolution of the oppressed peoples. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Eric. Yes, it's all forgotten. It's all forgotten. And Erdogan has, he postures as this great, new Ottoman Islamic leader. He doesn't give. Everyone is expendable for Erdogan. He'll be happy to use anything and everyone. And if he really had any ongoing principles, because his allies in Tunisia are continuing to be squeezed by Kais Saied, don't forget, that neo-Nazi piece of shit in relation to his comments against African migrants. But that aside, in Tunisia, Erdogan's alliance with Rashid Ghannouchi and Nahda, they're all being thrown in prison. So what I'm saying is that it's not like Erdogan is not still vested in certain political proxies, let's say. But when it comes to Egypt, there's bigger fish to fry than going on about the victims of the Ikhwan Muslim Brotherhood as victims of Sisi over there. Erdogan, he needs to team up with the Egyptians, especially around the Iranian situation as well, Iranian spheres of influence across the region, particularly now as it's coming in to the politics and the deals brokered by Riyadh in relation to Yemen, the machinations in Syria. Syria plays a very centrally important part in the politics of Turkey and Erdogan, as well as we've seen the racism against Syrian migrants playing a leading role in the Turkish elections recently as well. Yeah, I mean, they're coming together means really failing a lot of oppressed people in the states, in the region. Really, their rapprochement poses no great news and any positive developments.
If anybody who is following me on YouTube already saw the interview that I did with Khalid Madani all about the situation in Sudan, one of the points that he made that I think is relevant here that I would like to bring up is the fact that anything that happens in Sudan is connected to Egypt. That the Egyptians are always going to be the influential player in Sudan, that the Egyptians are going to do whatever they can to make sure that no pesky democracy movement emerges out of Sudan. And so now we have this rapprochement between Egypt and Turkey. And the question then also becomes what impact that might have in Sudan, because again, Sudan and Egypt are traditionally in lockstep. And that also not only raises the question of Turkey and Turkey's desire to have a port in Port Sudan, which brings them in conflict with Russia, but also the brewing conflict between Egypt and Sudan on the one side and Ethiopia on the other side over the control of the Nile water flow and the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is financed by the Chinese, at least partially. So now you have a potential water war emerging between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia. And here comes Turkey trying to take advantage by making deals with Egypt, obviously not so much over the Ethiopia question, but over the issue of the Red Sea, Libya, and a whole host of other concerns.
By the way, Indian Modi was in Egypt last week in Cairo, meeting Sisi. Very interesting as well. Just to throw that in as well. I think that's interesting, perhaps to look at another time. Yeah, I think you've said it. I think you've said it all really well there. I mean, do you know who Sisi and Erdogan respectively are backing in Khartoum? I'm not sure.
The RSF.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, going forward again, I mean, you have this. What I don't know what else to really add to your comments. I mean, it's just so bloody depressing, you know. I mean, we just went through the Tigray war in Ethiopia. There's the growing contradictions around the GRD, as you've mentioned. The awful things going on in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan at the moment. Sisi and Erdogan getting together. It's just like other kind of recent political developments. It's just the robber barons. It's just the violent robber barons just, you know, just getting together and to machinate in terms of what they can further extract from our people. I mean, it's just a disgusting whole story. And that's what made me laugh about Modi, who postures in all of his bigotry, you know, and anti-Islamic postures in India. Then he goes over in Cairo and he gives some donation to a mosque. And, you know, for these people, it's just, you know, it's just their super profits and their narcissism. That's just all that they are about. And then to think people are trying to attempt to construct some kind of politics that's relevant to the interests of the people out of all of this is just shake my head and look at all of this. Hello, Paul. Right. Yes, the great Tigray war, the great anti-imperialist war. No, never again will we have another NATO invention. So we need to do the Tigray war in alliance with Erdogan's drones, etc., to go rape and kill people, Tigray people in refugee camps. So thanks for that, Paul. I totally agree with your comment, in as much as I glean from it a sardonic contribution to our conversation. In as much, yeah, this is the contribution to humanity, you know, that these people are giving. Eric, any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really. I mean, the point here is that all of North Africa and the so-called Middle East are now a battleground. I mean, they always have been a geopolitical battleground, whatever you want to call it. But now the chessboard is much more complicated. The Russians seem to be receding to some extent. I mean, they won't admit that, and they may not even formally be, but it's clear to everyone around the world that Russia's position is, if not crumbling, then certainly weakening after Prigozhin's stunt. And naturally, people like Erdogan are going to want to swoop in and present themselves as a potential strongman alternative. Hey, you were depending on the Russians to help you militarily, to provide you with materiel, to do all of that. We can do that. We can provide that. And guess what? We're NATO. We're part of NATO, right? So in other words, Turkey is positioning itself to take advantage. I think that's clearly the case in Sudan. That's clearly the case in Libya. And that's even the case in Egypt.
I think years ago, and I agree, I think years ago, a situation like we've had in Nablus and Jenin and Hawara, etc., 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that would have electrified and radicalized the people of North Africa into other regions of Africa, the Middle East and further afield, to centralize the politics of anti-colonial people's struggle as it's inspired by the Palestinians. And look at the situation today, where again, the Palestinians in refugee camps like in Jenin are really doing some incredible, globally important leadership resistance work. And now, comparatively to 15, 20 years ago, how little response on the street the resistance now has. It's still inspiring, it's still honorable, it's still globally important and in the vanguard. But look where our politics has gone. Where are the mass protests? I mean, you probably remember the mass protests during the Second Intifada. Priests in mosques who did not support the Intifada were physically removed in Friday prayers across Egypt 20 years ago during the Second Intifada. The brutality of the Israeli state is just the same as what's his name, Sharon, Ariel Sharon, etc., when he was the leader. But it's sad to see, but it's not going to change my politics, and it hasn't changed yours, whichever the way the wind blows, you know.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's an important point that you made, that Palestine and Palestinian resistance remains at the center of all of these struggles, really. And even when we're not discussing it specifically in the context of a particular news story, it is always kind of related to all of this. And frankly, it's related to a lot of these issues that we've been talking about, including Saudi money that poured into Palestine to kind of guide the politics in their preferred direction over the 2000s and 2010s. That's certainly the case also with other countries, including Iran and others that have tried to influence the politics there as well. Erdogan himself has tried to instrumentalize the cause of the Palestinians countless times. So in many ways, Palestine and the Palestinian struggle continues to be a useful prop for all of these forces that you're describing.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I said the same thing yesterday in discussion with comrades when we did some events. Talked to young people about Palestine and France. Just similar to what you said, all the problematic leaderships, all the problematic states in the entire region are all involved, all interfering in Palestine, all trying to use Palestine for their own narrow self-interest. But the point of people's resistance, be it in the Minneapolis uprising, be it in the French uprising, be it in the Palestinian resistance, that class struggle, that cutting edge class struggle cuts through and pushes to the margins this kind of opportunistic and reactionary politics. And it's our job to clarify that and to keep the focus in that, because you're right. Of course, Erdogan is going to posture like he's the savior of the Palestinians. The Saudis do the same. The Iranians do the same. Even the Chinese and Russians in their own ridiculous ways do similarly as well. And it's important for those who are true to the Palestinian cause, true to the class struggle as manifested in the all means necessary of the Palestinian resistance and class struggle, to say, no, that's not true. This is what this struggle actually means, like the Algerian struggle back in the 50s, etc., etc., etc. These are all keep our legacies alive, keep our politics alive. It's really important.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. I have some more stories that I want to cover, but we'll leave it for our next live stream. I want to talk next time, Sukant, with you about the situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan and what's going on in that region, because it has global implications for Russia, for the United States, for Turkey, for Iran, for other players. But we are out of time. Folks, if you like this sort of stuff, go over and subscribe on the Patreon. There's the annoying thing at the bottom of the screen. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. That's where you can get a lot of this kind of stuff. Sometimes it's on YouTube for free if you're watching there, but oftentimes these things are going to be subscriber only. So go over there and do the thing. Subscribe, follow Sukant on Twitter at MX Movement and Facebook and everywhere else. And of course, also Counter Narrative News on YouTube and Twitter and so forth. So Sukant, as always, thanks for chatting.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Perhaps we can do a two-split way. Talk about the French uprising and then the politics of Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Oh yeah, well, we'll talk more about France as well, because I think that there's a lot more to discuss there. The Armenia-Azerbaijan question, and of course, none of these other problems in the world are going anywhere. So we're going to be talking about those as well. So as always, Sukant, thank you, my friend. We will talk next time. Viewers, as always, thanks for watching, for supporting, and we'll talk again next time.